Welcome to the show. Once again, I am joined by Eric Peters from Eric Peters Autos. Eric, great to catch up with you. How are things in the Commonwealth of Virginia these days?
Well, they're feeling kind of blue. This, this has been commented on by others, but I find it interesting because, as you know, it seems that a number of states, my state being one, I think Washington State is another, and even California, they're utterly dominated, the entire state government, by leftists, by the so-called blue, which is an interesting inversion. You know, you and I can remember when red used to be the appropriate color of the left, and then somehow it got switched. But at any rate, if you look at an electoral map, and I've got an article up on my site about this, and look at the geography of Virginia and the way things tilted as far as who voted for what, the overwhelming preponderance of the state is red rather than blue. Blue, you'll find blue in the hives around DC, the federal capital, the counties that are in that area, and Richmond. Now, it's interesting to me because you'll hear the left constantly talking about how much they love democracy. But it seems very undemocratic to me that the bulk of the state, the majority of the counties, are completely controlled by the handful of, the relative handful of the concentrated population of blue hairs, if you will, who live in and around the federal capital in Richmond, who basically are in a position now to dictate to the rest of the state. And that's how it's going to be going forward. And they lost no time in my state beginning to do that. They passed a whole battery of anti-gun measures, meaning, not for them, of course, because I doubt that Abigail Spanberger's guards are going to surrender their automatic weapons. They want us to surrender our pistols and our AR platform rifles and our high capacity magazines and all this other nonsense. And it's just suggestive of this new divide that's similar to the divide that existed back in 1860. Back then it was clearly geographical. You had the Mason-Dixon line, which clearly divided the North from the South. You got a similar thing today, but it's more complicated. It's urban hives versus the rest of the state, the rural parts of the state. And this is true across the country. And I don't know how this is all going to flesh out, but ultimately the dynamic is very similar. They don't like us, we don't like them. The difference is we're content to leave them alone. They're not content to leave us alone.
Oh, that is beautifully said. And that's the essence of collectivism. And I know we're kind of trained to see, well, it's Republican versus Democrat or it's red versus blue. But really, if we want to boil it down to, okay, what's the major philosophical breaking point? It's the individual versus the collective. And those on the blue side of the equation are very much about collectivism, some right to the point of outright communism, while those of us on the red part of the spectrum tend to lean towards individualism. And I will concede that even that can be taken to an extreme, but as long as a person's behavior is peaceful, they deserve to be left alone. Full
That,
stop.
that, that's my position. And I guess what sticks in my craw, among other things, is that just the disingenuousness of the left, which will mouth pieties about things like democracy. And another one is free speech. They love free speech when they're out of power. Then they're all for it. They want their right to protest. They want their right to say things online and so on. But the moment that they acquire power, we see what happens. Then all of a sudden, free speech becomes problematic. And we who are out of power no longer have the right to speak freely. This is emblematic of their nature, which again gets us back to this business of people who just can't leave other people alone, especially and particularly people who aren't causing any problems. You and I have talked about this before. I live in a rural Southwest Virginia county. We have essentially no crime, certainly no violent crime to speak of. And I wonder if that could have any correlation with the fact that probably more people have more guns here than they have cars. We freely and confidently leave our homes unlocked because it's just kind of understood. Probably everybody's got a gun, and if you're the kind of person who might want to break into somebody's house and want to attack people, you think again because you realize that person is probably capable of defending themselves. Contrast that with what goes on in Loudoun County and Fairfax County, where they've got all kinds of problems. And they don't have problems with people like you and I. They've got problems with thugs who legally aren't entitled to have guns to begin with, and nonetheless commit crimes with guns. It's fatuous. Spanberger, these leftists, they're not stupid people. What they are is highly manipulative and controlling people. They understand the issue. What they don't like, what they dread, is people like you and I having the ability to fight back. That's really what it comes down to.
And that, by the way, that's not just in states that may be purple or leaning blue. Even here at the local level where I live, we had, I think I told you about this, the county commissioners voted to make the DMV and other court, or I'm sorry, other county offices off limits to anybody who was carrying a weapon. I mean, they put up metal detectors and they were ready to enforce it before they were pulled back into place by the state attorney general and told the state's preemption laws do not allow you
Yeah.
to preempt state law, and where that's not a courthouse, you have no right to make it a secure facility where people are going to be checked and wanted and denied entry if they happen to be carrying so much as a pocket knife. And
Yep.
the crazy thing about it, one of those commissioners is running for reelection, and there's a picture of him carrying a pumpkin and this lofty language. I'm used to carrying the heavy load of making decisions about how things should be zoned and doing the right thing and so forth. And a good friend of mine, I'm going to give him a shout out, Jeff Pearson, wonderful writer, took it apart very carefully and just said, look, can you recognize the platitudes, the appearance of, oh, look, I'm doing this, I'm following the rules, I'm doing what I have to do, without ever actually elucidating what exactly are you doing? And more importantly, deflecting any responsibility from trying to attempt to restrict the citizenship or the citizenry, unnecessarily. And
Yep.
you just got to watch out for that slide of word that politicians will say. Well, look at me, I'm a good person and I'm doing all this. But if you'd want to press them on details, they had no answers.
Well, they also have something else. There's an undertow of supercilious contempt for deplorables, people like you and I. People like Spanberger, basically their core position at the end of the day is they think that we're idiot children. They think that we are not capable of responsibly organizing our own lives, let alone having a firearm in the house. We're just basically dumb children that have to be leashed, reined in, controlled, put into a pen, that sort of thing. They despise us, because this is the sort of thing that if you respect another person, you would never deny them something like a tool, a gun. Implicit in it is that you can't handle that. You're incompetent. You can't do that. They, of course, can. And they can surround themselves with people who they deem safe. To do that. So again, it just shows it's this divide. It's an attitudinal divide. And they smile at us and they mouth the pieties, but they hate us. And it's very important to understand that.
Well, and I'm sad to see that Virginia once again is revisiting, that trying to exert control over citizens being able to own firearms. Clearly, the left is learning from their mistakes. I know New Mexico is right now pushing. I think it may have passed at least one house and may have passed both houses of their legislature. But the language they're using in their new gun control law does not go after a specific, they don't list, well, you can't have this or you can't have that. They just say we are going to restrict the sale, not the possession, but the sale of any gas operated firearm that can accept a magazine and holds more than 10 rounds.
Right.
Think how much that encompasses.
Well, it's also incremental because some people will feel comfortable with the fact that, oh, they grandfathered in. They're not going to go after me and the gun I already own. It's just a process. First, make it impossible to buy one. Then, and I don't know whether they've done this yet, illegal to buy it in another state and bring it into this state. And then once that's been accomplished and once that's been normalized, then inevitably they're going to say, well, now you have to turn them in if you have them. Some people don't see. And it's almost become a cartoon character. Oh, it's a slippery slope argument. And they try to make it like conspiracy theory, but it's a fact. That's how it works. They get you to accept this in order to get you to accept this, and then ultimately you'll accept that. That's how it works. You either have a right or you don't. It's very binary. And once you begin to accept that your right is basically a conditional privilege, then that privilege can be rescinded at any time.
And I'm going to bring up a group. You probably haven't heard of them for a little while. JPFO, Jews for the Preservation of Firearms Ownership, which yeah, I know right now there's a lot of people. Hey, is that anti-Semitic to even say the word? But I'll tell you, I thought they were a very straightforward and stand-up group of individuals who made the strongest possible case for why you cannot give up your right to defend yourself. And they don't just point to the Holocaust, they point to numerous genocides that took place just within the 20th century to the tune of probably 200 million or 160 million people. Well, we won't quibble over the exact number, but it's tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of people killed by governments who first, in every single instance, disarmed those that were targeted for liquidation.
Absolutely. Historically incontrovertible. And just as an aside, I'm glad you brought this up. I am so annoyed by the way that we've been maneuvered into regarding criticism of the state of Israel and the actions of the state of Israel with somehow harboring anti-Jewish animus, that you don't like people who happen to be Jewish because you criticize the state of Israel. That's vicious, vile nonsense. I have personally got nothing against anybody who happens to be Jewish. I have a lot against what the state of Israel is doing.
Here, here. And I just point this out, the way they describe it is you would never turn loose of your life preserver if you knew that you faced the possibility of stormy seas. And no matter how safe you may feel in whatever state you live in, here in Idaho, I feel fairly safe, but I'm still not going to throw away my life preserver because that can change. And if it can happen in Virginia, it could happen here. I mean,
Yep. And here's another interesting fortuity that occurs to me, that you prompted me to think about, coming from the left that historically has tried to express such great concern for the disempowered and for women in particular. Well, the gun is the great equalizer. A man who is not yet old, who is in pretty good shape, has at least got the capability to physically resist a thug. But most women are completely helpless in the face of a powerful man, even without a gun. If the man doesn't have a gun, you just grab her, pick her up, and walk down the road with her if he wants to. Harder to do that with a man. So, a woman who hasn't got a gun is a woman who is at a tremendous disadvantage relative to men who might want to prey on her. And Democrats are all for that.
I like how you were describing in your article on your website about the Spanburgering of Virginia. You talk about where you live. There are still people who will leave their car or their home unlocked, and I only bring that up because when you live in such a setting, you are living in a high trust society, even if it's a little microcosm of the whole state or the whole nation. That is a society where people can trust one another. And I live in a very similar situation, and I love it. Some people think, oh, these bumpkins, they don't know enough, to lock their doors and whatnot. But I just spent 6 weeks living in Albuquerque, and everything is locked up. And if you don't have, double locks and security doors and so forth, people look at you like, are you crazy?
Yeah, I mean, I have the point of comparison in that I grew up in Northern Virginia, and I lived in one of those hive counties, Loudoun County, for a long time, and now I live in a rural Southwest county, and I'm not at all troubled by the fact that probably every single one of my neighbors, in fact, I know all of my neighbors have guns. I'm not worried about it. Why would I be worried about it? It's, as you say, it's a high trust society. They're not dangerous people. They're not going to come to my house and do anything. Whereas I still have a buddy who lives in my old neighborhood, and he tells me in Northern Virginia that you dare not leave your car unlocked outside in your own driveway, unattended for even 15 minutes with, say, a gym bag on the seat, because somebody will come, open your door, and take it. And if you leave your garage door open, expect everything in it to be gone. You have to lock everything down. Everybody's got those home security cameras and all of that's how you live up there. But up there, it's much more difficult to legally carry and buy firearms.
Hey, speaking of home security cameras, did you catch the ad for Ring doorbell
I heard
cameras that,
about
that
this. Yeah, the
aired
creepy
during the
way
Super Bowl?
they're trying to frame it as what, like somebody who's trying to find their lost dog or something.
Yes. No
And
problem. We'll just send a message out, and all the Ring cameras in the neighborhood will open their eyes and look for your dog.
it's horrible. And actually
Holy
saw,
cow.
you ever watch the videos posted by the civil rights lawyer?
Yes.
Did you see the one where a woman found a cop at her door, and this cop was accusing her of having been a porch pirate, having stolen somebody's package, because they claim the cameras saw her vehicle driving past the neighborhood. She lives there, and she was driving her car. So that became, and the cop insisted she did it. It turned out later she didn't, but she had to go through this whole big ordeal to prove that she was innocent in that were leveled at her because these cameras saw her vehicle driving through a neighborhood.
Yeah, it's we've joked in past years about we're building a panopticon where everybody's under constant observation, but that commercial I think inadvertently let slip that we're in a much more surveilled state than even those of us who recoil from such things would want to believe.
Yeah, being a Gen X guy, I'm very, very creeped out by it. But a lot of the people who've grown up since then are used to this, and I marvel at the so-called Internet of Things, where you have your refrigerator has a camera in it now, your oven, God only knows what else they're going to come up with. So your whole house is saturated with cameras and microphones, and they present it as being oh so healthy helperson. It's going to tell you that you need to buy more milk, you're running low, things like that, but effectively we're imprisoning ourselves. There was a time when the only people who had cameras on them were inmates in a federal prison. And what are we now? We're in a gigantic open air prison, and the gates are getting tighter around us all the time.
It makes me harken back to the telescreen from 1984. And you never knew if somebody was watching you while you were watching the telescreen or not. But it seems that we're headed that way. And for those who say, well, guys, if something like that was going on, the press would tell us, they'd tell us all about it, so we would be warned. But
Right.
that's not why the press exists.
Yeah, speaking of that, and I'm going to try to put this delicately because I don't want to say it the wrong way, because I'm sorry for what's happening to Savannah Guthrie's family. I think, it's awful that her mom got kidnapped. But have you noticed that that has become like the just slathered constantly over the screen, endless news coverage of Savannah Guthrie's mother, and next to in the mainstream media, I mean, and next to nothing about what's going on with regard to the Epstein stuff. So, on the one hand, you've got an inconsequential, it's a crime, but it's inconsequential in the sense that awful that her mother probably got abducted and killed by some guy. But we're not talking about something that affects the government. We're not talking about perhaps wholesale blackmail operations, at the behest of foreign powers using honeypot traps, a big story, a relevant story. Or how about what's going on with the economy and all these other things? Instead, we're, oh boy, we were supposed to genuflect and say how terrible it is that, Savannah Guthrie's family is suffering right now.
Hey, speaking of the economy, how about that exchange between Attorney General Pam Bondi and Thomas Massey last week? Holy cow.
She's just awful, but honestly, I find Trump more so because the fact that she behaved in that manner, despicable. And if I had been the president at that point, that would have cost her her job. Politically tone deaf, among other things, reprehensible on a purely human level. Those who didn't watch that particular exchange may not be aware that there were a number of the victims, women who had been abused in this Epstein stuff, who were literally standing almost directly behind her, who had stood up to be identified. She just callously ignored them and ignored everything that Massey brought up about the substance of the charge, and then infamously cried about, "Don't you know the stock market? The Dow is at 50,000."
Yeah, as if that somehow excuses whatever else is going on. I've seen some pretty interesting videos, some of them humorous, but still very pointed about how, but Baal, the god Baal is happy, and we our coffers are full, and we have plenty of money, and as if somehow that should distract us from the fact you're sacrificing children to Baal, that doesn't really matter.
But you nailed it. It speaks to the just callousness and the inhumanity of it. Looking at given everything that we know about what's been revealed so far, what sort of person thinks, what nihilistic person thinks, oh yeah, well it's just great that corporations are making bank in this, on the Dow, as opposed to potentially little girls being abused and women being trafficked and all this really horrible stuff. No sensitivity to it. It says something about her on a human level, I think.
Well, and it also illustrates that you cannot trust most mass media. And I'm sorry, that sounds like sour grapes from a wannabe podcaster out there who's just not reaching a big audience. I don't care how big my audience is. All I care about is am I speaking the truth as best I understand it. But when I see like the New York Times, and I'm trying to think who else. Oh, in Canada, we've had two pretty high profile shootings in the last week or so. One was a trans individual in Canada.
And that
One
disappeared.
and then last night, I guess at a Rhode Island hockey game, a trans guy shot his family and killed himself. And they're being reported as these women carried out these attacks, and it's like even in the face of tragedy, the media still is trying to push lies as news, and it's not to convince us, it's just to demoralize and wear us down, I presume.
Of course. And those stories got memory hold almost immediately. I've seen nothing about the incident in Canada precisely because it wasn't a woman. It was a mentally ill guy dressed up in women's clothes who did that. So when it doesn't fit the narrative, it goes away. But I guarantee you, everybody understands that if it had been a straight white guy, dressed up in fatigues and such, and who mouthed racist slogans, we'd never hear the end of it.
Yep, Governor Spanberger would be all over it as well. See, this is why we have to take away those nasty guns because you unstable white guys are likely to do something violent. Hey, there was something though that came out that actually felt like a little bit of good news last week, and that was the Trump administration announced that they were going to do away with some Obama era emissions controls. What do you know about that?
Well, what they did was to dismiss, reject, throw away, whatever the correct term is, something called the endangerment finding that dates back to the Obama era, wherein the EPA framed carbon dioxide, that inert gas that constitutes 0.04% of the Earth's atmosphere, as dangerous. And that served as the predicate for imposing regulations that served in turn as de facto electric vehicle mandates. That's where all of this originated from. Because the only way ultimately that you can comply with these regulations, specifically, they were going to jump the corporate average fuel economy requirement to 50 miles per gallon. The only way that you can do that is to manufacture electric vehicles. So effectively, electric vehicles qualify. The whole boondoggle dates back to this. It's all a bunch of nonsense. It's political stuff, purely. They were never required to establish anything as factual, just to say, well, the climate is changing and CO2 bad, CO2 bad, must get rid of CO2. Well, Trump ditched that. So effectively, if it holds, that's going to be the end of the EV thing. And it's also going to mean, and this is even better, I think, for most people, it's going to mean the end a lot of these compliance technologies, the proliferation of stop-start technology, the proliferation of hybrids and all these micro-sized engines, these little 1.5 and 2 liter engines that are being put in 4,000-pound vehicles with 30 pounds of boost on them. Not quite that much, but nonetheless, 10-speed transmissions with multiple overdrives, variable cylinder displacement, all this stuff. It's purely to try to figure out how can we just burn a little bit less gas and emit a bit less gas. So it is some happy news. I hope that Trump's actions don't undo all of this. I'm very concerned right now. Virginia got Spanbergered. Is the country going to get Spanbergered this fall? And then, 2028, what are we going to get then? And of course, if the left reacquires full total control of the political system at the national level, it's going to be easy peasy for them to completely undo everything that Trump has done that is good. And that's what worries me.
Okay, one final question for you, and that is, look, if we can't count on political saviors, and I'm taking that as a given, that means it's up to us to basically create our own support system. So, and I'm talking, at a familial level, community level, even neighborhood level. Let's talk about how do we go about finding middle ground with people who don't see the world exactly the way that we do.
Well, minimally try to get to know people in your orbit, your neighbors. You may not agree with them about everything, but it's much more difficult to behave in a dismissive or tyrannical way when you know the people. You know that, hey, it's Ben down the street. He's a good dude. He's a little weird. We disagree about this, that, and the other thing, but I don't want to see him hurt. I don't want to see him dragged out of his house. All those sorts of things. So that's very important, and you can kind of build on that by figuring out what you do well, and maybe somebody else does something well that you don't do so well, and you can engage in reciprocal, mutually beneficial activities. For example, if we have chickens and raise and have eggs. Maybe for us, having a cow and all of that is a bit too much for us to deal with, but we can swap eggs for beef. Things like that. I know how to fix vehicles. I'm not so good with plumbing. So, I've got buddies who are good with that, and we can do favors for each other, and it's all off the table, just between us, and that's good. The more that we can sort of just disconnect from these centralized control structures and reacquire more control over our own lives, the better off we'll be, the less control they'll have.
I know it scares people, the thought of leaving the familiar, although, you see more and more people walking away from both the Democratic as well as the Republican parties just going, I can't take this anymore. What keeps a lot of people in place is the inertia of fear and the unknown. And I offer this to anybody who feels politically homeless at this moment. Maybe politically, that's not where you need to be building your tribe. In other words, like you mentioned, Eric, neighbors, we have a common goal. We want our neighborhood to continue to be a high trust kind of neighborhood. So whatever differences we may have politically, we set that aside, and what can we do to look out for each other? I see a strange pickup parked in my neighbor's driveway, and guys prowling around that seem very concerned about whether anybody's watching. Of course, as a good neighbor, I'm going to let my neighbor know, or maybe bring the authorities in, or maybe intervene myself to find out what they're doing there.
Yep. What they want most of all is to isolate us. I think that that was at the end of the day what was really wanted with the COVID operation, to keep people, at home, away from their friends, their family, everything else, because it's so much easier to keep people in this sort of panicked, terrified, anxious state when they're separate from one another. We're social animals. The more social we are, and I mean really social, not the social media garbage, being on X and tweeting and Facebooking. I'm talking about face-to-face interactions, doing things with other people. That's how you build community. And then you have a high trust community once you do that.
I think that's sound advice. And Eric, as always, I feel a little bit better every time we have a conversation like
Me
this.
too, but maybe it's just the coffee. Hopefully not.
Okay, well, whatever it is, thank you so much for being my guest. I look forward to our conversation next week.
Likewise, Ryan.